Today's guest is Phillip from Sacramento, California. Thank you for speaking with me today. How are you?
Very well, Eva. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So can you tell me a few things about yourself?
Well, I really had two careers. I was with Barnes & Noble back in the early 80s for about 20 years, and that kind of launched me into financial services, which one form or another I've done ever since. During that period of time, the idea of business and economics has always fascinated me, although my educational background was in creative writing. Go figure.
And when did you start writing, and how has your journey as a writer been thus far?
I was a creative writer with an emphasis in Australian literature of all things back in UC Davis days. Wrote during that period and, actually lost everything. Didn't think much of it. And about 5 years later, an old college friend said, "How's your poetry coming?" And I said, "Well, gosh, I lost that stuff." About a week later, he sent me, probably 10 or 15 fairly good-sized poems from memory. And at that moment I thought, well, if he's going to take this seriously, then I suppose I should. And from then on, as the urge took me, I would go ahead and write a piece or two down. Last year or so, I've taken it much more seriously just because I've had a chance to get involved with an amazing scene here in Sacramento. It turns out we're one of the hotbeds of poetry anywhere in the world, and I'm very proud to be associated with this group.
Maybe I'll come out to Sacramento, because I'm thinking Cleveland has an excellent scene, but, I haven't seen anything else, so.
Well, I see that you do that in Ohio, and when I see the number of things coming out of Ohio as well, it's just amazing the places where people aren't necessarily looking. We think of culture in the U.S. as being New York and San Francisco, and it turns out that there's a whole lot going on elsewhere.
Yeah, poetry is definitely alive and not dead like some may think. So I see you also write essays. Can you tell me a little bit more about those? What topics you cover and whatnot?
Just coming through. Did you ask about acting?
I didn't, but do you act?
I was a theater guy back in the early 20s. I actually did it in my 20s, not the 1920s. And actually did a fair amount professionally with it. And I haven't done it for about 30 years, but there's some relation there between theater performing and doing live readings with poetry. Once you sort of had that experience of being on stage, you understand that part of the job of a live reading in poetry is to be somewhat entertaining, I think. And, I don't know that is always the case when it comes to live readings. We poets tend to be perhaps a little more introspective, less oriented to the performance of the poetry. But I know that I thoroughly enjoy it whenever I see a poet do a live reading, and perhaps using musical instruments or just really letting it fly from a performance standpoint. And so I've kind of tried to work that into everything I do from a live standpoint.
And I agree. There needs to be, I would say, a theater perspective in reading poetry. I've been to a reading called Living Poetry. And the one poet, he's also an actor. So he dressed up a little bit, had props, and he read as well, which is an amazing experience when you combine the two arts like that. And also, I see you write essays. Can you tell me a little bit more about those?
I think that it sounds like such a wonky thing, but it seems to me that there's hardly anything more dramatic, more central to our daily lives than what's going on in our personal economies, which turns into our local economies, our national economies, and international. It's one of the few dramas where the outcome isn't assured. And so I find it absolutely fascinating. It occurs to me as I write both about economics and poetry, I find that economics is more art than science. Poetry is more science than art. There's a craft to poetry, but there is an interpretive value to economics. So they challenge my mind in different ways, but when I put them together, they're both very satisfying for me to write about.
That's interesting. Also, as a poet, what achievements have you accomplished, and where can we find your work?
Well, I'd like to think that I really just started going public, as we say in the business vernacular, with poetry about the last year or so. So I'd like to think that my best days are ahead of me. But one thing that I'm very proud of is, I mentioned that anecdote about that old college buddy. Later on, he went to study at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London, and for their master's exam, so to speak, they were required to perform a classic piece. And this is with all the emeritus in the room, all the great British actors, including Anthony Hopkins. So rather than doing a piece of Shakespeare or John Donne or what have you, my friend chose to do my poetry, which, given everything else that was being read, was, one, a risky venture, but two, afterwards, Anthony Hopkins evidently came up to him, so he says, and says, "Who did you read? I like that very much." So when we think about what we want to accomplish as poets, which is basically to have an impact, a memorable moment in the reader or listener's life, it just doesn't get any better than that when someone says, by golly, of all the great poets that I've read, I'm going to quote this fellow. And so I hold that one as a personal achievement. I think most people would say that I've invented this little short form that's getting a bit of notice, and people would say, well, there's your achievement. You've done that. And I wouldn't, I'm kind of pleased with it, but on balance, if you ask me, I would say it was that moment at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, having my poetry performed, that has a warm spot in my heart.
Yeah, as a poet, when, you impact somebody, it's all part of a poet's, calling, I really feel. And I really enjoy your tri-cubes. I would love if you read a few, can you?
Oh, certainly. The rules of tri-cubes for me, and it's just a form I made up, are that these poems all have 3 lines, 3 stanzas, 3 lines per stanza, 3 syllables per line. And I started writing them because I tend to math anyway, but it was just a reminder to me to not write too long. Get it done. And so I thought, well, what kind of form works? And, just in general, 3s tend to be pleasing to the mind. So I thought, okay, well, we'll make this thing 3 stanzas. And then I thought, well, okay, let's take that a step further and make it 3 lines per stanza. And then just to make it tough, I went with the 3 syllables per line. 3 times 3 times 3, cube in the mathematical sense. The hard thing is that you can't use a 4-syllable word in this thing. I started writing them around the financial crisis last year. And given my background, the first tri-cubes I wrote were business tri-cubes. I'll read for you. The very first one